Jason and Emily parked their car in front of their new home, an old yet charming structure. After months of searching for a place that symbolized the fresh start they desperately needed, they had finally found the ideal house. It was on a quiet street surrounded by ancient trees, offering a sense of seclusion that seemed like the perfect solution after a tumultuous period in their relationship. "It seems perfect, doesn't it?" Emily said, smiling at Jason with an expression that masked her slight unease. Jason nodded, but his gaze lingered on the house's facade, where the windows seemed darker than they should have been at that time of the afternoon. Something about the way the shadows gathered there felt off, but he quickly dismissed the thought as just moving day anxiety. The first days were consumed by unpacking boxes and arranging furniture. The air inside was fresh, and the walls solid, but small details began to catch Emily's attention. The constant creaking of doors, the faint echo of her footsteps that seemed to continue even after she stopped walking. It was as if the house had its own sounds, a secret language only they could hear. "It's probably just an old house settling, right?" Jason suggested one evening when they heard a door close by itself. Emily agreed, though she couldn't ignore the chill that ran down her spine. Something about the house felt slightly off, but she chose to brush it aside, believing it was just a matter of adjusting. Deep down, they both wanted to believe that the new home would fix everything, as though its walls could contain the problems they had been struggling with. The initial optimism began to wane as the night set in. Jason, who usually slept like a rock, started waking up in the middle of the night, his breathing labored and his heart racing. The room was dark, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. He scanned the room, his eyes adjusting to the dim light, but everything seemed normal. Yet, the sense that someone or something was there lingered. Downstairs, Emily noticed an unexplained chill in the living room, even with all the windows closed. She adjusted the thermostat, but the cold persisted. Worse, she felt a pressure in the air, as though the space was filled with an invisible presence. "Have you felt this too?" Emily asked one evening after Jason mentioned his restless nights. He hesitated. He didn't want to sound paranoid, but the truth was undeniable. Something was wrong. The house seemed more alive than he was willing to admit. "I feel like we're being watched," he confessed, crossing his arms uneasily. "But there's nothing there. It has to be our imagination, right?" Emily nodded, but they both knew it wasn't that simple. The noises, the icy drafts, the constant feeling of being observed by something unseen, it was all too much to ignore. The unease grew, and although they avoided discussing it openly, they began to avoid being alone in the house. The tension between Jason and Emily began to surface in subtle ways, like small arguments over trivial matters. The atmosphere in the house seemed to amplify these tensions, making the air feel heavier, as though it carried their unspoken words. On a particularly rough day, they found themselves arguing in the kitchen, something rare since they had moved in. "You always do this," Emily said, her voice slightly raised. "You always think I'm overreacting when I notice something strange. And you always think I'm too rational, like that's a bad thing." Jason shot back, clearly frustrated. A sudden crash interrupted their argument. They turned to the shelf, where several glasses had toppled to the floor, as if pushed by an invisible hand. The silence that followed was deafening. Jason and Emily exchanged looks of pure shock, unable to ignore what had just happened. "See?" Emily whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "There's something here, Jason." For the first time, Jason didn't try to deny it. The truth was, he felt it too. Something or someone was in the house with them. And now, for the first time, it had manifested physically. The couple spent the rest of the day in silence, each processing what had happened. The shock of seeing objects move on their own and feeling the presence grow more tangible that turned their initial discomfort into genuine fear. The argument was forgotten, replaced by the realization that they needed to unite against a force they didn't understand. That evening, they avoided eye contact but silently agreed they had to confront this new reality together. The following weeks were a living nightmare. Jason began waking in the middle of the night with the sensation of invisible hands pressing on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He would wake up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding, but the room would always be empty when he turned on the light. The suffocating feeling, however, lingered in his mind. Emily, meanwhile, experienced her own inexplicable events. While alone in the house during the day, she felt faint touches on her skin, as if something unseen was brushing past her. Out of the corner of her eye, she often saw shadows darting quickly, but when she turned to look directly, there was nothing. The nights became endless cycles of terror. Both began having the same recurring dream, an invisible force chasing them, trapping them inside the house. In these dreams, the walls seemed to close in on them, and every attempt to escape was futile. They woke up exhausted and emotionally drained, as though the entity haunting them was feeding on their energy. The malevolent presence seemed to exploit their deepest fears. Jason, usually the rational one, began doubting his sanity. He started drinking more at night, trying to block out the oppressive sensations. Emily avoided the house whenever possible, finding excuses to stay out, but even when she was away, the fear lingered. Their already fragile relationship began unraveling further as the invisible entity fed on their insecurities and heightened their conflicts. They knew they had to do something, but what? How do you fight something you cannot see? After another heated argument during which Jason nearly smashed a nearby object in anger, Emily decided it was time to investigate the house's history. She spent hours at the local library, poring over old records and talking to elderly neighbors in the area. What she discovered was horrifying. The house had a dark past, and previous occupants had reported similar experiences. Doors slamming on their own, objects moving, and the unshakable sense of being watched. Most of the previous residents had abandoned the house within a short time, and those who stayed longer often descended into mental instability. Emily returned home with a stack of documents and old photographs. When she showed them to Jason, he was silent for a long time, staring at black and white pictures of previous families who shared the same haunted expressions of despair that he and Emily had begun to wear. "So it's not just us," he murmured. "This has been happening for a long time." They realized they were dealing with more than stress or strained emotions. A deep, malevolent force was at work. They decided to set up cameras around the house, hoping to capture evidence of the entity, but the recordings showed nothing but an eerie emptiness. Even so, both knew the presence was there. The suffocating sense of powerlessness grew. Whatever was attacking them remained unseen, and each passing day in the house seemed to push them closer to emotional collapse. That night, Jason and Emily decided to take action. They lit candles throughout the house, repeating protective phrases they had found on internet forums. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, intensifying their anxiety. Suddenly, the house fell eerily silent, as though the air had been sucked out. Jason felt a crushing pressure on his chest, like invisible hands were squeezing him. He gasped for breath as Emily, by his side, screamed, claiming she saw shadows moving rapidly around the room. The house seemed alive, its walls pulsing with an unseen energy. In a desperate act, they both shouted simultaneously, "Leave us alone." A heavy silence followed. The candle flames extinguished abruptly, plunging the house into darkness. Jason and Emily stood frozen, their hearts racing, waiting for any sign that the enemy had retreated. In the days that followed, the house became oddly quiet. The footsteps, the icy drafts, and the oppressive sensations of being watched were gone. Jason and Emily, emotionally drained, began to believe they had finally banished the presence. Yet, something felt off. The tension between them persisted, though it was more subdued. They tried to resume their routine, but every minor noise sent their hearts racing. One afternoon, as Emily was home alone, she heard faint footsteps upstairs. She froze, her body tense. Staring at the ceiling, she listened as the steps continued. Her heart pounding, she chose not to investigate. Deep down, she knew the truth. Although silent, the invisible enemy had never truly left.